I've been noticing an issue with this Zoho Backstage template that I created a few months ago using the Zoho Backstage Pack. In case you don't know, Zoho Backstage helps you manage different events, and I use it for managing TPM meetups like this page right here. But I noticed that this table of attendees and the events down here were constantly requiring me to sign back in to my Zoho account in order to refresh the sync table. And I didn't realize this until looking at the documentation for Zoho Backstage, but there's this notion of a refresh access token. And let me walk you through a really rudimentary diagram of what this means. When I created the Zoho Backstage Pack, you have to use OAuth in order to allow the user to authenticate with their Zoho Backstage account. I honestly could give two shits about how OAuth works, and it's like a black box to me. I just know that it works and people can log in with their Zoho account. Once you log in with OAuth, I'm not going to walk through the process there. This is the output that you get. You get an access token, a refresh token, API domain, token type bearer, and it expires in 1 hour. And so when you make a call to the Zoho Backstage API, some URL, zohoapis.com, you have to include this access token as part of the header in order to authenticate the call to get data back from the Zoho API. If you don't have this access token, which comes from this thing right here, then you won't be able to utilize the API. So within the first hour, the pack works fine. You can log in, get data, but then I noticed that after an hour, this table would break because it would require me to re-authenticate. So what happens after 1 hour? Well, that original access token that you get from the OAuth is no longer valid. And if you read through the documentation here, to generate a new token, use the refresh token you generated earlier. And so there's a cycle here where when you authenticate with OAuth, you get a refresh token, which never changes. And so once that access token is no longer valid after an hour, you can use this refresh token to call the token URL to then get this output, which is a new access token, also expires in 1 hour. And this new access token can now be used with the API to retrieve data. So the key thing here is once this access token is no longer valid, you can just use the refresh token in the original OAuth to essentially refresh and get a new access token and do this over and over again. So I thought about what's the best way to do this with the pack, and I found out that there's actually built-in token expiry and refresh mechanisms with the Coda Packs infrastructure, which is really, really cool. Basically, it says Coda does not track the expiration of these tokens, the access tokens, but instead waits for an API request using the token to fail before attempting to refresh it. Specifically, Coda only does a refresh when the pack has a status error, or the OAuth provider returned a refresh token during a previous token exchange, which is what happens with the Zoho Backstage Pack. Here's what this could look like if you had to do this manually without the Coda Packs infrastructure. This is pushing the knowledge of my technical abilities, so I'm not sure if this is correct, but you'd have to do some try and catching to see if the response from the API gives you a 401 error. And if it does, then you have to get a new access token. And in order to do that, you have to call some refresh helper function where you pass in a refresh token, a client ID, a client secret. And then in this refresh helper function, you're calling that original V2 token, whatever URL, to get a new access token from that OAuth V2 token URL. There's a lot more that has to go on behind the scenes here. And if I look at some of the Google Apps Script examples, they have this OAuth 2 library. Someone created this OAuth 2 library to allow developers to create their Google Apps scripts utilizing OAuth so that other people can log in with their credentials. But it requires a bunch of setup, and the refresh token is somewhere down here, and it all relies on this notion of the state token builder class within Google Apps Script. This was more than I wanted to do because again, I just don't care about how OAuth works. I just want the pack to work. Having to do all this just to get the data out, which is the more interesting part for me, I instead relied on the Coda Packs infrastructure. And this is all the code in the pack that's required to the access token, do the refresh, and Coda on the backend automatically checks to see if you need to have a new access token. What I'm trying to say is the Coda Packs infrastructure here simplifies a lot of the back and forth exchange between the access token and the refresh token without you having to write custom code like this to try the API. If it fails, you have to call some other helper function you write, which is totally doable, but just requires a lot more work and a lot more testing. I thought this was a really interesting use case for OAuth, which I never learned about. Again, I don't want to learn about this ever again. It was fun to just dive into it for now. The key takeaway is that the Coda Packs infrastructure makes it super easy to do OAuth, and the code is all right here. And also, if you check out the Zoho Backstage Pack, all the code is also available for you to check out.